representative from the UN office, from embassy here as well, and as some reputable researcher resided in Phnom Penh who joined us.
We can certainly accommodate that just at the end as we wrap up. All right, so thank you all for joining. Today we're going to get started momentarily. We're just giving people about 30 seconds to come in from the waiting room.
So welcome everyone to this morning's event. Tonight we have panelists and participants calling in from the United States and our colleagues there in Cambodia and Phnom Penh, others calling in virtually from Phnom Penh and other parts of Cambodia and the world to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements and launch a very important report that goes over the history and the progress of this monumental agreement signed 30 years ago. My name is Brian Eiler. I am the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program. And tonight's virtual event is one that is a collaborative event between the Stimson Center Southeast Asia Forum, which is led by Bill Wise, and we'll be meeting Bill Wise very soon, and the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. And this is actually our first official joint project together, and it's just a delight for the Stimson Center to be working with CICP colleagues and friends. Tonight, we're going to launch a report that was co-authored by my esteemed colleagues, Ambassador Pooh Sotarak, Dr. Bradley Merg, Ms. Charadine Peach, and my colleague, Courtney Weatherby at the Stimson Center. We're going to hear from the authors tonight, as well as from other speakers throughout the evening. And brief housekeeping remark is that if you have any questions that you would like to ask to the panelists, please write them in the Q&A function, and our team will monitor the Q&A box to ask questions and pose them to the panelists. So again, welcome everyone. We're here to celebrate and to examine the history and the progress of the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements. And I'm going to turn it over now to our special guest, the DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy to Cambodia, Benjamin V. Wohlhauer. And before coming to Cambodia, from 2017 to 2020, Mr. Wohlhauer was Consul General at the U.S. Consulate General in Florence, Italy. Prior to that, he served at the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs as the Director of the Office of Economic Policy. From 2012 to 2015, he was the Deputy Economic Chief at the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. Other overseas postings include Milan, St. Petersburg, Rangoon, and Tokyo. Benjamin, thank you for speaking tonight, and over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. And I bring greetings from Ambassador Murphy, who is really excited, along with the rest of the embassy team, about this report and about the interest shown on both sides of the Pacific to commemorate this 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements. As a professional diplomat who joined the Foreign Service a couple of years after the Paris Peace Agreements, it's particularly exciting to me because of the incredible achievement of international diplomacy that the agreements represent. But that's really obviously just a small part of it. But I and the entire embassy team are very grateful to the authors, the editors, all of those who participated in the drafting of the report, both at Stimson and CICP. I know it was a lot of work, and at least you had a firm deadline, which sometimes helps to get things done. But it looks fantastic. It's also gratifying, of course, to see so many people joining in virtually. Actually, it's great to be in person with at least a few people here. It feels a little awkward, but very nice. But it's great to see so many people tuning in from the US, from Cambodia, from around the world. To me, it really demonstrates the interest that continues throughout the world and among people who were involved, people who are diplomats or students of diplomatic history, but also a younger generation who are interested to revisit some of the lessons, both from the negotiations and also from the Paris peace agreements and the constitution that came subsequently. So I think everybody knows 30 years ago on October 23rd, 1991, the 4 conventions and treaties that make up the Paris peace agreements were signed after a remarkably lengthy and complex series of negotiations chaired by France and Indonesia, but involving 17 other countries, including Cambodia and the United States and the United Nations. As I said, and just to emphasize that the scope of the agreements and the number of parties involved make the Paris peace agreements a remarkable diplomatic achievement, really an important chapter in diplomatic history, which would be worthy of commemoration and study on its own. But of course, these agreements also laid the groundwork for an end to the decades-long civil war here in Cambodia, and paved the way for Cambodia's constitution, which guarantees human rights and multi-party democracy. Also importantly, the agreements, the negotiations, the agreements, the contents of the agreements demonstrated the will of the Cambodian people to embark on this very ambitious experiment, democratic experiment, after so many years of turmoil. And I'd say that the primary vision of both the Paris peace agreements and the subsequent constitution is that political power rests with the Cambodian people. Now, the world has changed a lot since 1991. 2 of the original signatories no longer even exist as political entities. But I would say that the agreement's principles, inclusive government, true multi-party democracy, protection of fundamental freedoms and basic human rights are as relevant, if not more, than they were back in 1991. Plain and simple, history has continued to show that countries that genuinely respect human rights, protect their people's fundamental freedoms, are more peaceful, prosperous, and stable. Unfortunately, and I think this is also an important issue to talk about as we look at the relevance of Paris today and what's next, the aspirations of the Cambodian people as reflected in the agreements and the subsequent constitution remain unfulfilled. Thus, on this 30th anniversary occasion, it's important that all 19 signatories, including Cambodia, stand with the Cambodian people to reaffirm the Paris Peace Agreement's principles and commitments. The United States will certainly do its part, continuing as we have for the last 3 decades to actively seek, support, and encourage Cambodia's development as a prosperous, democratic, and independent partner. Indeed, for the last 30 years, the United States and our implementing partners have invested heavily in achieving the agreement's vision. Our assistance alone has topped $3 billion, and we are continuing to invest significant sums every year in Cambodia's development. Most recently, of course, the focus has been on efforts to combat COVID-19 and help Cambodia and the region get back on track with post-pandemic economic recovery, but also investment that has paid huge dividends in the areas of malaria, combating HIV/AIDS, supporting Cambodia's goal to be landmine free by 2025, and to help preserve civic space in the country. Cambodia has, in the last 30 years, experienced significant economic growth, and Cambodians are living longer, healthier lives. Education levels are increasing, spread of communicable diseases decreasing, And I think much of that, certainly not all of it, but much of it can be credited to the spirit of Paris and the commitment of the entire international community, not just the United States, to the Cambodian people. So as I noted, looking ahead, the United States continues to be committed to supporting Cambodia and the Cambodian people to encourage continued development and prosperity, independence, as well as a return to the multi-party democracy envisioned in the Paris Peace Agreements and guaranteed in the Constitution. So I'll stop there. I know we're more interested to hear from the actual authors and experts on this topic, but thank you again to all involved and for those who are participating today.
Many thanks to the DCM all over for these very excellent scene-setting remarks. And in my opening welcome remarks, I failed to mention that this report and this event today are sponsored and supported by the embassy in Cambodia. And we're really grateful for the US Embassy's provision of this grant. It was awarded through a competitive process, and also providing CICP and the Stimson Center an opportunity to collaborate together officially for the first time. And I think that also kind of marks the spirit that is derived from the Paris Peace Agreements as well of international cooperation. This is exemplary of that. I'm going to turn the mic over now to Dr. William Wise, who will serve as our moderator for the entirety of the event. Bill, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for your very insightful and encouraging remarks, Mr. Wallauer. They indeed touched upon some of the things that we want to talk about today. Well, good morning in Phnom Penh and elsewhere in Cambodia and Southeast Asia, and good evening to those of us up a little late in North America. My name is Bill Wise. As Brian said, I chair the Southeast Asia Forum at the Stimson Center. We created the forum almost 2 years ago to promote the study of Southeast Asia at colleges, universities, and research institutes in the US and in Southeast Asia and beyond. You can find out more about us on the Stimson Center web pages. As DCM Wallauer noted, our discussion today examines the Paris Peace Accords, which happens also to be a topic of special interest to young persons, students, and beyond. We'll look at the accords from their origin, their design, the political meaning, and the efficacy through the lens of this very excellent report prepared by the 4 authors who we will meet shortly. The report's a thought-provoking analysis of the historical legacy and the contemporary relevance of the accords, and it raises many important questions. We'll discuss what's in the report, perhaps look at these questions, look at the report's conclusions and see where they take us, examine the research methodology employed to collect and analyze the data that led to these conclusions. But most important, we'll look at how the Paris Peace Accords and this report might help Cambodians steer a future course for the nation. To begin our discussion, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Pooh Sotarak, Executive Director of the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. He's a distinguished diplomat who has served for the past 7 years as an advisor to the royal government of Cambodia. The ambassador directed the study that produced this fine report. Ambassador, this report is a major accomplishment for which we are all in your debt. We look forward to hearing your comments tonight.
Thank you very much, Williams, for your very kind introductions. I am very pleased to say a few words about the PPA report that my institute have been working on intensively in the past 5 months. Let me begin by tracing back when CICP decided to embark on this research study. As we remember the Paris Peace Agreement 30 years ago today, as well as to say a few words how the report has come to being today. Immediately after I noticed the announcements on the 22nd of February 2021 made by the US Embassy in Cambodia, announcing that the US Department of State is looking for organizations to submit grant proposal to produce a report, study, or documentary that mark the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreement on October 23rd, 2021. 1991. CICP quickly enter into an agreement and cooperation with our MOU partner, the Stimson Center from Washington, D.C., to apply for this grant immediately. At this point, CICP wished to thank our partner, the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., for playing an important role in securing the grant from the US Department of State to undertake a rigorous research project to produce this report from 1st of June to 31st of October. Over the past 5-month project implementations period, CICP and the Stimson Center have been endeavored to collect data from interview with a range of key stakeholders and produce a public report laying out the continued relevance of the Paris Peace Agreement for Cambodia, not only in the past, but for the future. This report has 3 objectives: to examine Cambodia development since 1993 and assess the opportunity and challenge within the context of the Paris Peace Agreement, to determine the contemporary relevance of the Paris Peace Agreement and explain how the agreement can serve as a focal point for Cambodia future development, and to set out the lesson learned for our future generation from the implementations of this agreement. Please allow me to brush over the background and the project overview of the PPA report as follows. The 1991 Paris Agreement was signed 30 years ago this month, bringing to a close a dark era of Cambodia past, marked by genocide, war, domestic conflicts, and foreign occupations. The agreement are an essential account that redefine not just the tragic history of Cambodia, but that of Southeast Asia as a whole. However, the agreement and their historical importance are often sidelined or ignored in discussions of current affairs of national and regional politics. Contemporary interpretations of the outcome of the agreement exhibit a mixture of positive and negative benefit of the treaty. Some scholars and experts contend that Cambodia have already achieved the vision set out in the agreement, while others argue that the country remains adrift in its applications toward elements of the agreement and as such call into question the actual relevance of the Paris Peace Agreement. Both CICP and Stimson Center hold the view that on the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreement, it is appropriate to comprehensively review progress to date as to its implementation and to explore a forward-looking way how the Paris Peace Agreement vision remain relevant for Cambodia future. This research project seeks to re-examine the initial visions of the agreement, the role of various state and individual actors, and their place in the context of Cambodia in the past, in today, and in the future development. For me personally, the PPA gives birth to a new kingdom. Although this is not exactly what I would want to see the effects of it for today's Cambodia, nonetheless, without the agreement, my country have only 2 choices: Pol Pot self-destruction regimes or Cambodia under firm control of foreign force. One important reason that I am and my research team from CICP agreed to do this report is to try to pass on the agreement legacy to the next Cambodian generation with some truth of its intent, purpose, and revive the spirits of a political settlement rather than civil war and foreign occupation, and that the international community wish for my homeland. I was a part of the PPA spirit, and I cannot bear that as time go by, we must allow this important history to slip away with the passage of time, where there were so many brave men and women who have sacrificed their lives, both Cambodian and foreigners, for the sake of bringing peace back to Cambodia and allow the Kingdom of Cambodia to re-emerge again with pride and dignity. Being lead researcher for this project, I wish to acknowledge the hard work and the valuable contribution from two of my senior researchers, Ms. Pitch Charadine and Dr. Bradley Merg, for their active and valuable involvement. I also received important input from Dr. Raymond Weiss, senior researcher, fellow at CICP, and two younger researchers, Mr. Seung Bun Lee and Mr. Humrat Smay, from whom I'm also thankful. I am grateful to my dear friend, Ambassador Julio Heldres. He's here also with us in person, joining this launch, who have given me and my research team access to an open collection of his rich reference material related to the PPA, including rare photographs. In addition, in the report, Ambassador Julio have given a staunch account of King Sihanouk throughout the 1990s and the role of other state and actor in the making of the PPA. I am indebted by the constant support and guidance given by my institutional partner, the Stimson Center's finest researchers such as Brian Eiler, Courtney Weatherby, and William Wise for their indispensable role in realizing this report. I wish to thank profoundly more than 40 eminent personality, experts, and scholars from local, regional, and beyond the region, and from whom my team and I have kindly received their valuable insight and recollections of the PPA account through the interview process. I shall not fail to acknowledge the valuable support given by the U.S. Embassy in Cambodia, represented here today by the Deputy Chief of Mission, Mr. Benjamin Wolauer, who have just given us an excellent opening remark. I wish to express my sincere appreciation to the U.S. State Department for making the grant available to make the PPA report part of the contemporary record for future generation of Cambodia to remember. Let me conclude by saying that the PPA provided an initial roadmap 30 years ago for Cambodians to rely on as they navigate this path and give Cambodia a unique chance to rehabilitate and reconstruct itself as a modern functioning nation. After 30 years, Cambodia has transformed significantly from a war-torn country that once experienced mass atrocity and foreign intervention to a fast-developing and responsible member of the international community. While significant challenges remain in a country development path, there is no doubt that Cambodia can stand on our own 2 feet as a unitary, sovereign, and independent nation with development well underway. Thanks to the desire for peace and the spirit of national reconciliation born out from the Cambodian leader and all Cambodians from all walks of life, as well as the strong support from the international community as stipulated in the PPA 3 decades ago. On behalf of CICP founder and chairman, His Royal Highness Samdech Norodom Sirirut, I wish to dedicate this report to all the great Khmer leaders in particular to His Majesty the late King Father Norodom Sihanouk, to all civil society actors, and to all of the brave Cambodian and foreign citizens, as well as to all other signatory states who have worked hard to safeguard Cambodia independence and provide invaluable support to rebuild Cambodia that enjoy lasting peace, democracy, and prosperity. I hope the public will read this report and will find this report interesting. And please do let me know if you have any feedback or comment. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
And thank you very much, Ambassador, for that very comprehensive, thoughtful review of the report. And I must say, your very heartfelt comments. This is an excellent beginning for our discussion. Let's turn now to our panelists for their comments. But I should note at the outset that our two speakers, Ambassador Pooh Sotarak and Benjamin Wollauer, the DCM at the U.S. Embassy, have very generously agreed to join our panel. So we will be a panel of 4. But now I'd like to introduce the other 2 panelists from whom we have not yet heard. Bradley Merg is a distinguished senior fellow and senior advisor at the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. He's also associate professor of political science at Paragon International University and senior academic advisor at Future Forum and lead editor of the Journal of Greater Mekong Studies. Charity Peak is deputy executive director of the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. She's also in charge there of research, training, and publications. She serves as coordinator as well as coordinator of the Global Center for Mekong Studies, which is an official track 2 think tank network engaged in the Mekong area. So let me begin by our discussion by asking Bradley Merg and Charity Peak to share their thoughts on the significance of the PPAs 30 years after their signing. Around these fundamental questions, why, if at all, are the Paris Peace Accords significant today? What is their contemporary relevance to Cambodians and to others concerned with this country and the prospects for conflict resolution elsewhere? Do the Accords provide a basis for current policy? Are they possibly a roadmap for Cambodia's future? What are your thoughts? Let's start with Bradley Merg.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you very much, Ambassador Pooh and DCM Wollauer, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let's just begin precisely with that question from Bill, do the PPAs have contemporary relevance in Cambodia and globally? And I think it's easier to work out from the global side broadly as a comparative political scientist. And this goes to one of the questions that we asked initially and that we examined from the outset of the report and really throughout of the Cambodian conflict, the lengthy, protracted, tragic Cambodian conflict is a problem that if you look back at, going all the way to the origins and having seen documents back from 1979 in the archives with initial discussions within the United States government along, well, where does this go? How does this get resolved? It's really quite difficult today for many of us to fathom the level of complexity that was involved in the eventual development and signing of this agreement. And it goes to a perennial question within political science, the division between structure and agency. And one could look at the PPAs and see them saying, well, we see the end of the Cold War, we see the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. These were inevitable. These were simply a conjunctural outcome of a particular set of macro historical factors. And that would be an incorrect reading. What we have and what we've found here is that as much as structure does matter, and one certainly can't deny that a shift from a world of bipolarity to a world of unipolarity had a major impact. That is key. We also see enormous amounts of agency. We see both agency by individual states, as well as by particular actors acting in their various official capacities, as well as acting both domestically by both Cambodian actors, as well as by the international community. And that really goes to the question of the complexity of the agreements and the challenges there, looking at the sheer number of individuals involved, both within Cambodia, as well as within the global community, going through and exploring the preparatory work, the work that was entailed by Southeast Asian colleagues, the Jakarta meetings, the Bangkok meetings, et cetera, and seeing the sheer number of states involved in this process. But ultimately looking at, again, as Ambassador Pooh noted, particularly the two leaders of Cambodia, particularly His Majesty the late King Father, King Sihanouk, and the role that he played and the role that Cambodians themselves played, that this was not an imposed external solution. Rather, this was an agreement that included both Cambodians obviously representing various factions, various groups, but the 16 or so different countries that became ultimate signatories to the agreement. So on that level, I would say as a comparativist, when we're looking at the intractable frozen conflicts or other conflicts of today, and there is no reason, historically speaking, that at the end of the Cold War, Cambodia could not have become another Yugoslavia. It could not have become another rapidly failed state. There are myriad examples of post-communist transition states falling into that level of chaos. Cambodia had obviously the famous phrase, as we use in the report, by William Shawcross, sideshow. Unfortunate term, but obviously quite well known. And there is no reason to anticipate that in the early 1990s, Cambodia would have made it to such a central point on the global agenda without significant agency and action taken by particular individuals. And as we sort of continue on with the panel discussion, I just want to make one or two other brief notes before letting me turn over to my colleague, Ms. Shardine Peak from CICP. There's one other aspect of this report that I'm personally very grateful to the American Embassy for its support, to Ambassador Julio Heldres, to Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, Ambassador Charles Twining, and Ambassador Gareth Evans. So many folks who have come forward and have been incredibly helpful, promoting a truly global scholarly effort to add to the history, to add to and build on the historiography. The report, which is available presently, you can download it from the Stimson Center homepage and later today from the CICP webpage itself. And so it is available for reading, for viewing, for commentary, and we very much look forward to it. But this is also, I think, a key step forward in US-Cambodian scholarly cooperation, which we do not see an enormous amount of, and is really a key next step for the kingdom as it moves forward in the development of its own research capacity, et cetera. So the fact that this was a scholarly partnership between CICP and the Stimson Center, I think, is quite worthy of noting. One final note just on methodology, and as we move forward, and the subsequent development of study of the PPAs, is our report is by no means, and will be by no means, the final word. There's still significant archival material out there that's not available. But one thing I did want to note is we've obviously gathered significant new material and significant new research from such a large number of key actors in this process. Due to constraints of space, we were unable to use all of it. However, all of that will be available in the CICP archive for future research work and for future researchers. So not just producing a report, not just a report outcome that will serve the scholarly record, but being able to expand the data available to future researchers, I think will also be useful, and for the comparative study of dispute resolution for those in my own field of comparative politics, examining this question of protracted internal conflict. So with that, let me just pause and let me turn over to my colleague, Ms. Shardine Peak, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weiss and Dr. Merg. As we have extensively heard the historical roadmaps, the complexity of different political factions in Cambodia back then, the role of international communities that eventually led to the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement in 1991. I wish to put that in context and reflects upon the PPA in contemporary Cambodia. There are three main key points that I would like to highlight. First, on the relentless effort of international community, the PPA indeed paved the way for Cambodia political reconciliation to be realized, bringing all political factions to the negotiation table instead of continuing to fight guerrilla wars. It has also shown ASEAN overall commitment and dedication toward a peaceful and stabilized political environment in the region. The PPAs and UNTAC, however, did overlook the importance of disarming Cambodia faction, particularly the Khmer Rouge, as well as the lack of compliance to the requirement in reducing the number of troops to 30%. This resulted in the continuation of dispute, which lead to the re-emergence of some security challenges, as well as complicated the country power structure throughout the entire process, especially during the 1993 election, which further exacerbated the insecurity dilemma, as Dr. Merg has extensively discussed earlier. Mistrust has also continued in recent decades. An event in 1997, for instance, has shown the deep and long-term implication on Cambodia democratic development. Second point on political reconciliation and political settlement. So the political deadlock after the 1993 election was then resolved through the dual prime ministerships and the power sharing mechanism as proposed by the late King Sihanouk. Not for long when the clash broke out again in 1997 between the two main political forces. Conflicts ultimately ended in 1998 after the last group of Khmer Rouge guerrilla were formally integrated into the Royal Cambodia Armed Forces as part of the win-win policy of that Prime Minister Hun Sen. This total dissolution of the Khmer Rouge political faction and its military organ, and especially the returns of all area, which had previously succeeded to government control, has played an important role in creating a path toward a more complete political and social unification process in Cambodia. Now, coming to my third point on the societal understanding of the PPA itself. There are indeed have been different understanding of the PPA, and here I would categorize it into two main group of perspective. One was of the view that the content of the PPA have been well incorporated into the 1993 Constitution already. However, others argue otherwise and view the PPA as a benchmark toward which implementation should continue, given that key element of political development envisioned in the PPA have not yet been achieved. Fundamentally, the relevance of the PPA in today's context remain a point of debate. Cambodian youth in particular have not been significantly exposed to the PPA as part of their study and beyond, and there appear to be a lack of motivation to do so. So as part of this project, a short survey was run and reached out to more than 100 Cambodian youth. About 75% of respondents range between 18 to 25 years old, particularly among university students, to try to understand the depth of their understanding of the PPA in general and its relevant today's in particular. The majority of those surveyed, of about 62%, responded that they were fully aware of the PPA, yet when asked to describe briefly of the essence of the PPA, responses were generally vague and in some cases were widely off the mark. Some respondents said that PPA was the agreement to grant Cambodia full independence from France, and others assumed it was an agreement signed by 18 signatories to end conflict in Indochina region as a whole. But surprisingly, some responded that they were not really aware of the PPA and did not understand much about it, yet they thought that the PPA are still of relevant in today, in Cambodian context today. A minority of respondents, and I shall elaborate this into its extensions, I think, because it's quite interesting too. A minority of respondents provided answer that demonstrated a clear and concrete understanding of the PPA as a reconstruction effort of Cambodia, as well as an introduction to the rules of law, self-full determination, and the reintroduction to election. However, of those who understood what they were, some thought that the PPA were no longer relevant today in light of the subsequent political development of the kingdom and the beginning of factional politics. Others perceived the PPA as a concrete foundation or even a blueprint to guide Cambodia in resolving conflicts through peaceful means. The role and effort of the international community were unfortunately not much mentioned by those young respondents. Conversely, some respondents highly commended the role of foreign signatory and argued that the PPA are still very much relevant for Cambodia. And I shall quote here at length. We cannot forget about it, saying that we have a constitution, so PPA is invalid. Even though Cambodia has a constitution, PPA validity and spirit is there to serve Cambodian interests. And I'd like to link that to what DCM Bowler mentioned earlier, that the political power rests with the Cambodian people. One also linked to that quote that I mentioned from our respondent earlier, not only Cambodia, but he or she also think that one country could who led and joined PPA in Paris should revitalize PPA to serve the common interests of Cambodian people, end quote. So after 30 years, what have we been through? So this year is perhaps the most auspicious as we commemorate the 30-year anniversary throughout. Of course, it is subject to debate, but I would leave it with a few questions as food for thoughts. Should PPA serve as a benchmark to assess or even to evaluate what have or have not been achieved or implemented? Should the PPA be imposing a policy rules like a few have pointed out? Or should the PPA serve as a guideline for more constructive collaboration between the 18th signatory with Cambodian and beyond? I shall stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you. It is a masterful stroke to leave us with such provocative questions. And perhaps we can use some of our remaining time to see if there are some answers. But first, I'd like to turn back to Benjamin Wollauer, DCM at the U.S. Embassy. First, I'd like to say, Mr. Wollauer, that the CICP and Stimson are deeply grateful to you and to the U.S. Embassy for supporting the grant that made this report possible. This is a major contribution by the Embassy, and you have already seen the great returns that are a result of your effort. I'd also point out that your presence here is another indicator of U.S. support for the Paris Peace Accords on one hand, but also for contemporary relationship between Cambodia and the United States and perhaps future. So based on what you have heard from these other panelists, I wonder if you could comment on where Cambodia fits in now and in the future in U.S. policy interests, given the history that we've been talking about this morning and this evening.
Yeah, thank you. And I would echo the sentiment expressed earlier that this collaboration between Stimson and CICP is an important example of academic exchange, collaboration between think tanks and organizations that are at the top in both of our respective countries in terms of quality of researchers and influence in policymaking communities. So the embassy and the U.S. government in general continues to be very encouraging of this type of exchange, this type of engagement between scholars, between experts, between students, business people, people-to-people ties, generically put, remains at the center of our strategic priorities here in Cambodia and regionally and globally. And as a segue into the broader question, Cambodia to the United States is a very strategically important country in a very strategically important region, in a very strategically important Indo-Pacific part of the world. So there's no question that we remain very focused on the situation here. And as I noted before, have invested quite a lot, both in terms of human resources, but also financial resources in supporting the Cambodian government and the Cambodian people bilaterally and in the context of ASEAN, and more recently in the context of Lower Mekong, now Mekong-US partnership. I think we saw yesterday the president announced even further concrete support for specific priorities within ASEAN. So I think that, and also his participation in the meeting. Again, these are all bits of concrete evidence that I think should be quite convincing to people that the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN, and member states of ASEAN are central to US international strategic priorities and policy. So, I mean, as Brad said, the Paris Peace Agreements were not an imposed solution. This was an agreement that brought a huge number of actors to the table with divergent interests, to say the least, a very, very diverse group, and that they were all able to come together to sign and endorse a vision expressed by the Cambodian people, as I noted, from a diplomatic perspective, is really remarkable. Almost very difficult to imagine that being possible very frequently. So it's an agreement, it's a series of agreements that deserves to be taken seriously as an achievement in diplomacy and in political, and a political statement that I think is incredibly relevant and needs to be paid close attention to. It was certainly the pathway to resolution of conflict and to the civil war, return of refugees. There's no doubt about that. And we've seen, obviously, a lot of progress in that front in the years following the Paris Peace Agreement signing. Our interest, though, remains in supporting the principles of the Paris Peace Agreements, and as they were codified, so to speak, in the subsequent constitution, because, again, these are a reflection of the will of the Cambodian people. And these certain principles, such as human rights, protection of fundamental freedoms, pluralistic elections, these things, the aspirations of the Cambodian people have not yet been fulfilled in this regard. And so we remain focused on those issues because globally, the US government believes that protection of those basic human rights are essential to our national interest, but also globally to the global interest, because as noted, countries and regions where democracy, protection of fundamental freedoms and human rights, where these things flourish, you have far more stability, far more prosperity, and countries that are independent and sovereign. So we will continue to support the aspirations of the Cambodian people as clearly stated in the agreements and then the constitution. And that goes both to the continued development of the country as discussed in terms of our foreign assistance, but also in our encouragement and support of the other issues which I mentioned. And frankly, we view this type of people-to-people exchange as a crucial component of maintaining that civic space, room for free debate and discussion on all array of issues.
Very interesting. Well, thank you very much. Ambassador Pooh, you have heard a variety of thoughts now about the Paris Peace Accords from your co-panelists. I wondered, first of all, if you had a response to any of these thoughts, but one in particular I wanted to ask you about, and that is the issue that Cheridang Peak raised concerning the exploration of young persons' knowledge of the Paris Peace Accords and their views on the meaning of the accords for Cambodians today. If we acknowledge the report's finding that there is not a high level of appreciation for the role of the Paris Peace Accords, and the role of international organizations as signatory states in making and helping these events come about. How would you suggest that greater knowledge, greater information about the PPAs be dispersed in society, in particular among young people? So first, your overall reaction to what you've heard from your co-panelists, but also perhaps focus in a little bit on this idea of how do you get young people to understand history?
Thank you very much, Dr. William Weiss. Again, I subscribe totally to early comment made by all panelists, including from our guest of honor, DCM Benjamin. I wanted just to add one more issues before I go on with what I think the future generation of Cambodia should see, should try to maximize the benefit of PPA for the greater interest of Cambodia well into the future. But one thing that I've been, this is the first time I'm giving my talk about the PPA in Cambodia, both in local context and also in international setting. I observed that there is still a lingering issues that still confront unfortunately, the debate sometimes take us off the road a little bit. I think the intent of the Paris Peace Agreement is to give Cambodia a roadmap, a plan that Cambodia themselves have to take their own future in their own hand. In other words, the destiny is in your hand kind of thing. PPA have just done that. But there are individuals who feel that the PPA should continue to be a sort of like a policeman to policing whether some of the agreement have not been done properly. Now, the only thing that I can see that there's issues like why don't the signatory states, some country, take a lead and invoke the Paris Peace Agreement and sort of check on the implementations of the current government in implementing the PPA. These issues, I think it is misunderstood, and if you continue to have it debate without some explanation, it's not going to be healthy, both for Cambodia and for the international community who have a genuine desire to work together in a common aspiration. So I wish that there will be more debate about this and deeper debate on some of the flagrant issues that come out today. There's even issues like, is the Cambodian constitution in 1993 superseded by the PPA and vice versa? And this is a hard things to talk about, but we need to endeavor to do so. Now, I wanted to thank you so much for asking the question, what can we do to promote a greater participation from the youth in the PPA? Yesterday, I was invited by my good friend to talk to a group of Cambodian university students. And there's one student asking me the question, should the PPA be a curriculum taught in school? I mean, I find this very interesting. So I answer this way. I don't think that the PPA should be an educational curriculum per se, because curriculum is have to be more general. Nobody beside Cambodia is going to go to that university and want to learn, you know, if you brand PPA Cambodia and so on. More like normally academic curriculum is more general, or social science, humanities and mathematics or physics and so on. But nonetheless, I think there is a genuine desire for younger generation of Cambodia, particularly university students, want to hear more about the PPA. And as I mentioned in my opening remark, unfortunately, as time go by, hardly no one talk about it. I can guarantee you, 30 years ago, I was at the Paris Peace Conference observing the signing. I was not a signatory to the agreement, but I was there to witness this. The signing. So I was very happy and enthusiastic, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel. At that time, it was more of a try to safeguard Cambodian sovereignty against foreign interventions more than human rights and democracies and elections and so on and so forth. But then again, to promote student interest in this, I also asked students, to all Cambodian and students particularly, to focus more on what more can they do to improve or to make PPA more relevant to the current context of Cambodian reconstructions and rehabilitations process. And I think signatory states, including the US, you have heard DCM Benjamin reassert again that the US committed to support Cambodia in promoting liberal democracy, human rights, freedom of expressions, and all these. There's no doubt about it. We need to continue to engage and being open-minded about it. And we need not to go over the board. We need not to become agent provocateur, particularly from the student side of it. If you want a debate of this important nature to continue to make greater relevance, you need to also focus on the solutions aspects. You can raise a question, you can ask a question, but be positive about it. Don't try to don't focus too much on the negative aspects that is sometimes born out from perceptions. There's no real facts, and so on and so forth. So my suggestion is that there ought to be more debate about this. I'm talking about my research team here. There might be a second versions of this report, and if the US Embassy is willing to support us, we may drill even deeper into those lingering issues based on the question that was rightly asked by Shahruddin at the very end. I think it's very pertinent, but we have to be able to open up these issues, bring these issues to the table and debate about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was a very thoughtful response, and I think we all appreciate the perceptive way that you are viewing these important questions. And thank you all for a very interesting conversation. Now we open the floor, the real floor and the virtual floor, for questions to our very distinguished and knowledgeable panel. Joining me to manage the Q&A session is Courtney Weatherby, the Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Stimson Center and one of the authors of the report. For the Q&A session, Courtney.
Thank you, Bill. So just reiterating for those who are with us, we do encourage you to ask questions and share comments in the Q&A chat. I see that we've got one ready to go now, so I will go ahead and share that with our panelists, but please do keep the questions and comments coming. We hope that this can be an interactive conversation. So as I think all of us are very aware, there are many different perspectives that are out in the public being debated about the validity and value of the Paris peace agreements today. One of our questions from the audience is about sort of that debate, to the extent that certain parties, including the Cambodian government, have indicated that they feel the PPA is no longer valid, given that there's the Constitution as the top law of the country. We've obviously discussed many other perspectives here today. So the question is just, can any of our panelists shed a little bit further insight into the status of that debate and your thoughts on sort of the various points that are being made in the public space right now?
So who you want to ask? We have 4 here, quite eminent.
Indeed. Well, I'll direct it first to you, Ambassador Sotarak, since I think
Okay.
you're most familiar with this conversation.
Thank you so much. I think this is really a burning question. This is, as I mentioned, there's a lot of there's many people who talking about the relevance of the PPA in the present context of Cambodian politics and so on. Now, let me just generally say this, that to me, the PPA remain as relevant as ever, so long as Cambodian people still think that the spirit is good, is useful, it's helpful for Cambodia to move forward in a liberal democracy, in the rule of law, in suppressing all the ill effects that modern society have to confront. If all Cambodian or any Cambodian for that matter still think that we still need PPA, it still remain relevant. That I want to start with that. Now, with the PPA, some corner would say that the PPA is no longer up to date, or let's say dead. Some people even say PPA is gone already. It's like old stamp. They put it in a collections book, you shell it somewhere. There's no need to talk about PPA. I think that people have to know the context through which the question is asked. Precisely what I'm saying is that usually there is a pretext or the background behind these questions. More often than not, when I heard this question addressing to the government of Cambodia is that why is it that you don't, why did the Cambodian government stick to the PPA when there is no real improvement in, say, human right, or election was not held freely and so on and forth? So why is it that the PPA did not do something about it? The signatory state would do something. First and foremost, as a trained diplomat and a politician by training, it will not be easy. You cannot invoke, in my view, treaty it will be very difficult to get the international community to have a reopened PPA conference again and address these issues. Because what I mentioned earlier, the PPA is a roadmap. The international community with the Cambodian faction at the time under the Supreme National Council, SNC, have already signed this document. So the international community give this treaty to the Cambodian people. So the Cambodian people themselves have to make it happen if there is a shortfall somewhere in the agreement, like I mentioned in my statement as well. It is the Cambodian people should ask themselves what they can do more to do this. We should not, we should refrain from impede or obligate any signatory state to do the policing for us anymore. We should really take our own destiny in our own hand. And I think I have to say this also. I think that the current government, from attending the commemorative 30th anniversary organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I hear from the Minister of Foreign Affairs himself, is committed to this process, that the government of Cambodia is in full respect of human rights and freedom of expressions, so long as it is within the confine of the binding law. And so the debate here is how you implement this law and how one would go about expressing their grievance toward the government, for example. So this is tricky issues. So to me, it is remain relevant so long as the Cambodian people think it is useful for the good future of Cambodia. If we don't think it's useful, the signatory state will not impose anything on us anymore. They give this, they will be happy to help us, including the United States, who support this project. As you can see, and then you hear from DCM Benjamin that the US continue to help Cambodia promote democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth. So individual who ask these questions, I think you can ask this question, but be part of the solution rather than try to pin something down that we cannot have a solution to this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I would like to turn it over to any of our other panelists. So I think Brad had indicated that he might chime in on this question as well.
Sure. Thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Ambassador Pooh. And there is a very wide spectrum of thought on this topic, and I think that's shown very much in the report itself. I wanted to draw attention to two particular quotes in the text. I think that shed light on this. Right at the outset, we have a very interesting comment by a senior official speaking personally, not representing his government, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, who highlights regarding the agreement itself that this means that Cambodia and other parties are legally bound by these agreements. At the same time, however, together with the Constitution of Cambodia, they set a firm foundation and principles of Cambodia's political system, which is a really interesting point of discussing, well, does the Constitution supersede the Paris peace agreements, or are these two together essential within international law? How do they interact together? How do we parse that legally? A very interesting point of debate. At the same time, right towards the end, we have former Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, and citing remarks that he had made in 2018, noting very initially, saying, well, on the one hand, this would be just a very significant political challenge if there was international action based upon the PPAs, but also very, very importantly highlighting the nuance. Moreover, the language of the agreements talks only in the event of violations of, quote, taking appropriate steps, Article 29, or calling upon the competent organs of the United Nations to take such steps. And again, this is Foreign Minister Evans' remarks. And anyone trying to invoke these clauses would be met with the argument that appropriate steps are already being taken through the reporting mechanisms of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. So this brings us to yet another level of complexity of how do we view those, how would we view the PPAs through the lens of existing international institutions, through the lens of the role of the United Nations currently here in the kingdom, et cetera. And thus it's one of those topics that the more we get into, the more diversity we see, both in terms of views and then sub-views and then actions and then potential actions, et cetera. And it won't be a question that we'll be able to settle here today. It's one that I think is going to be a key element of debate, both public and scholarly, over the coming years. And hopefully the report does provide some benefit here in terms of shedding light on the nuance and the diversity of that debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. And I'm not sure if the DCM or Chardine would like to chime in on this question before we move to the next one, as we are starting to get a few coming in from the audience.
Maybe I'll just add one more point very quickly. So on PPA, apart from the political reconciliation and political settlement that we have extensively talked earlier, I think one of the main other main component is on institutional building that has been almost clash during the Khmer Rouge period and so on. So that helps to rebuild the institutions, including all of those three pillars of within the government institution. But beyond that, I still like to recall that PPAing whatnot is, in fact, it's more like a journey, not a destination, if you like to put it that way. In other words, it should always be treated as a work in progress of having these signatory countries, the 18th signatory, working with Cambodia to support what has been laying out there rather than imposing a policing role. And I don't think any signatory is interested to do imposing a policing role either, whether or not those points has been implemented. So just to recap, it's a work in progress. It's of course, the agreement was signed in 1991, but the essence, the content therein should be implemented throughout. Thank you.
There is Ambassador Julio here want to say something.
First of all, the Paris peace agreements, they don't have an expire date, so they remain in force. But we are talking here about the Paris Agreement helping Cambodia to regain sovereignty, to help the Cambodian people to regain their rights. And unfortunately, I don't think the Cambodian people have regained their rights. There is no freedom of expression. There is no political freedom. There is not a multi-party democracy. So that's the problem. It is the leadership that needs to address all this and comply with what is stipulated in the Paris Agreement. Without the leadership doing anything about this, we can continue to pontificate about the Cambodian people, and the Cambodian people, but we are not going to reach anywhere. We will continue, and in 30 years' time, there will be another celebration of the Paris Agreement, and nothing will have changed. It is necessary for the leadership to adopt all the measures that will make the Paris Agreement and the Constitution of Cambodia relevant, and that will help the Cambodian people to achieve truly what it was written in the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Can I add to my dear friend? I think Ambassador Julio have raised a very important point, particularly the responsibility of the government of Cambodia. As I mentioned, the PPA is done 30 years ago. After it's completed, it's a role of the government of Cambodia have to take over. I agree with Ambassador Julio that there's still remaining a glass half empty to be filled up with regard to some elements of the Paris Peace Agreement. There's no doubt about it. But you see, the point here is that, and being I serve as a minister in the government in the first term, I understand the conflicts in Cambodia very much. There was 4 factions coming together. The Paris Peace Agreement promote national reconciliation. But even with that, I have to say the wound have not been completely healed here. And therefore, when you raise these issues of responsibility to provide human rights protections, to provide freedom of expressions and so on, the government themselves, I believe that they have done some credible work to this effect. But sometimes there is a lack of communication, in my view, between a promoter of human rights, advocacy work in human rights and the government. That's very difficult, and we need a matchmaker, in my view. We need someone to help, because the government said we have everything, we done everything, we really, and if you ask us, we support, we promote democracy, and you can hear from the speech of prime minister to the minister and so on and so forth. But the implementations of it is a problem. So how you get the government and the group that want to really genuinely promote that to sing together and address these issues together rather than question one another, as Ambassador Julio raised. So I like to suggest a think tank like us. That's why I propose that the debate have to bring to the table, being think tank, think tank, right? If you bring anything to think tank, they really, if you have some illness, they will tell you what you have, they no shine, they speak their mind, you get the expert in, they do it. But with all due respect, it is very difficult sometimes to engage policy maker in the debate, and sometimes this lack of understanding. But I think through event like this one, and throughout the past few days that I see, I think the government have heard some voice from the society as well. Individual rights have not been fully respected. I'm just hoping that there is some kind of mechanism whereby they can sit down together and really scrutinize or debate, and then come to a conclusion what both need to do together to promote human rights, to have freedom of expressions, to have social justice, and to stem out corruptions and so on. I really hope, but nonetheless, platform like this one would be good, and we try to engage policymaker. We try to encourage policymaker to also join in so that they can hear directly from the grievance from the ground. That would be really perfect. But more importantly, we need to also make sure that when we do this kind of thing, we are not part of the problem. Like I said many times over, please do not project ourselves as part of the problem. This is something that the government does not tolerate. If you are part of the problem, they will take, the government will take strong positions about it. And it's very difficult to do this. It takes some skill, and it takes some convincing and some diplomacy. But I'm quite happy that many times over I hear official statement from the government. Everything is nicely said already, but the implementation, improve the implementation. And so signatory state maybe can help government in finding a mechanism, implementation mechanism that they can do better in than just aspiration, statement of wish, and so on and so forth. So taking note of Ambassador Julio, I think that's why I said there ought to be a PPA report version 2 or something. Thank you.
So thank you all for that. I think that has opened up a conversation which will continue well beyond the bounds of today's event, and which I hope many of us can continue, on future calls and eventually at in-person conversations. I know we've got about 7 minutes left for the Q&A before we end up having to start wrapping up the discussion. And I see we've actually got 3 questions, which are all looking at various aspects of sort of the lessons learned from the Paris Peace Agreements process for not just Cambodia, which has been the focus of our conversation so far today, but also for the region as a whole and for many other issues in ASEAN. As was framed in sort of the opening remarks, the Paris Peace Agreements process obviously has great importance for Cambodia. It also has great importance, or should have great importance, for diplomats and policymakers engaged in conflict resolution elsewhere in ASEAN and around the world. And I'll just note, as someone who is part of that younger generation, who is young enough that I don't remember the process or seeing anything about the process as it was ongoing when I was young, and who, despite engaging in international relations and political affairs, didn't have the understanding that I have now gained through this report process of the complexities of the Paris Peace Agreements, that it is very important to sort of focus in on these lessons learned, not just for Cambodia, but also for the region. So we have 3 questions from the audience that I'm actually going to combine into one and ask each of you on the panel to perhaps address a different aspect of looking at how Cambodia can utilize the Paris Peace Agreements moving forward, specifically thinking about how Cambodia, recognizing that this is still in many ways an ongoing debate, an ongoing process in Cambodia that has not yet reached the culmination that many would like it to. Are there opportunities to share those lessons learned from that conflict resolution process in other internal conflicts? One colleague has asked about specifically the ongoing crisis in Myanmar, if you see parallels and opportunities to share lessons learned from Myanmar. Another attendee today asked about whether there's any opportunity to apply lessons learned to another intractable ASEAN conflict in the 9-dash line and debates in the South China Sea. And finally, a third participant today has noted that they're curious about whether there are opportunities to utilize lessons learned in conflict resolution from the PPAs to address border conflicts like those between Cambodia and Thailand. So none of these questions were directed towards a particular panelist, but I'm going to actually just ask each of the panelists to sort of jump in and share their thoughts on that lessons learned aspect, starting with Ambassador Sotarak, and then Brad, Charadine, and if DCM Wolauer would like to comment, we'll end with that.
I will boycott my right just to save time. I think this question is very important. It's going to take another 4 hours, believe me, to really dissect that. But maybe Shadin and Bradley can answer. I'm reserving my concluding remark, if it's all right.
Please go ahead. I'll shift it over to Brad then.
Sure. I think there are a few things to note. It's really interesting to look at the question of lessons learned, and I do think that in terms of broader conflict resolution, yes, this is a very important case that has been brought into the literature as regards the question of particularly the resolution of domestic political conflict. So when one looks at the question of Myanmar, I think that it is worth examining this process. But at the same time, we have to look at the fact that we are celebrating the 30th anniversary, and the global community has changed, and Southeast Asia has changed significantly. While we did see, and there was a very strong role played by Thailand and by Indonesia, et cetera, during the Paris Peace Agreement's development. Today, we do have an institution. We have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations that sought to take a leading role on the Myanmar question, and to a great degree, I would say that is the path that should go, unless we see a fundamental absence of progress, at which point other states who have voiced their support for ASEAN would really have more responsibility to become involved. On the question of the 9-dash line, I think they're not remotely comparable. The 9-dash line question, fundamentally what we observe is this is a created global problem, a problem created by one state, illegally claiming ownership over the South China Sea, impeding freedom of navigation, impeding freedom of transit, and which we've seen consistent action and response by the Western powers, by the countries affected here in Southeast Asia, et cetera. At the same time, when we saw the Hague Tribunal ruling, we did already see a global ruling by an international body about the South China Sea. This ruling has been set, adopted. The Philippines had asked for it, and the key actor, China, simply refuses to abide by the solution that the global community has come to. So unfortunately, while the South China Sea is one of the most pressing global security matters, Beijing I don't see as an actor that is willing to play by those rules, and rather is seeking to implement something of a revisionist solution in this context. But that does not mean that the PPAs generally can't be seen as important, particularly for domestic conflict. Let me end my remarks there. Thank you so much.
Just quickly on Myanmar issues, I'm not sure if we can adopt the same modality of PPA in the context of Myanmar nowadays. I mean, Bradley pointed out that the current dynamics of regional power, regional competition is more intense than it was 30 years ago. It was totally different. We might already question the existing international order or regional order, if you like to call it. So it's getting more complicated. The recent ASEAN summit shows some significant things without Myanmar participation. So we're not sure whether this whole process will be able to utilize having Myanmar, bringing Myanmar to the table, whether a special envoy to ASEAN will be able to facilitate his own roles and mandates and of some sort. So I mean, it begins with Myanmar factions itself, whether they want others to help assist breaking the deadlock. Of course, Myanmar people express the interest, but whether the real people who have the power, do they actually willing to settle to the table? So that will be leave the uncertainty here. Thank you.
Just very briefly, not to add too much to what the experts here have said quite rightly. On ASEAN, of course, the United States has clearly stated our support for ASEAN's centrality and our commitment to supporting ASEAN's efforts to resolving the crisis there. We had a very senior official just in the region last week talking to ASEAN member states, of course, US, ASEAN, and EAS this week will also reflect that. Just very broadly on PPA's relevance to general crises in the world. I mean, I think two important takeaways or elements. One is, the importance of international law and multilateral settings for dealing with crises that involve complex crises that involve divergent interests and diverse sets of actors. These can be global crises, or these can be regional or more macro or micro crises. And the other thing, though, I would comment, and in terms of what the role is of the international community vis-a-vis Paris peace agreements 30 years later, I think the ability to bring together a coalition of international powers to sign an agreement that resolves or puts a crisis on the road to resolution has been a very good model for Cambodia. It has generated a sense of common responsibility, which has led to a tremendous commitment on the part of the international community, the United Nations, but also the signatories and other countries who've invested a huge amount financial resources and human resources in supporting the aspirations of the Cambodian people as reflected in the agreements and the subsequent constitution. So I think that the value of building that type of international coalition to witness, to sign, to help implement an agreement resolving a crisis has a tremendous value.
Thank you. And I know we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left in the session. So I just want to thank all of our panelists for this discussion. I think there are many questions and comments which we could continue to explore with those in the room and on the line with us today. But unfortunately, we're going to run out of time if we start that conversation. So we'll have to continue it in future. So with that, Ambassador Sotarak, I'd like to turn things over to you for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Again, I want to thank everyone who joined us here in person and as well as online. I have following to say for my concluding remark. It is overwhelmingly recognized that the signing of the PPA and the lengthy political stalemate in Cambodia and guide the country toward peace and prosperity the kingdom enjoy today. This reality is recognized across multiple social economic metrics in present-day Cambodia, particularly in a rehabilitation reconstruction process. This year, I observed more than any other time before the direct relevance of the Paris Peace Agreement in the current political context of Cambodia is currently being debated intensively by state and non-state actors as well as some of the signatory states. Beyond the argument about the PPA have been superseded by Cambodian constitutions or vice versa, the vision that they laid out for liberal democracy in Cambodia and the principle of governance and the respect of human rights are still enshrined in 1993 Constitution. Now, I like to take pride in mention I was one of the drafter. In 1993, during the provisional government, I was assigned by my boss to be drafter of the constitutions. Also, if you look at the 1993, the original version, you will see my name in there among other 32 members. So I was representing Funsun Pek. So I think their liberal democracy is dear to my heart. Good governance, the respect of human rights is all still there. And I don't think the government present day walk away from that at all. Progress along the road toward a full, inclusive, transparent, and fair government is inherently difficult, and it is an ongoing process, as Shireen said, in any democracy. And Cambodia road has not always been an even and a direct road. Despite significant progress, there are still delays and sometimes significant bumps in the road that will need to be addressed through continued effort across a range of challenging issues for all stakeholders, the government, friend to the government, signatory state, civil society, everyone need to get involved in this process, addressing these challenges. With regard to the future of Cambodia, it's my earnest hope that this commemorative day of the Paris Peace Agreement can yield valuable lesson in finding progressive, cohesive, and pragmatic political economic and social development for Cambodia, avoiding the recurrence of the tragic history of disunity and instilling the culture of compromise so as to lay the foundation for lasting peace and development for the future generations of Cambodian. For all Cambodian, we should endeavor to do more to fulfill all the promise originated from the PPA. We should understand that the significance of the PPA is about upholding of all the instruments adopted under the agreement in order to ensure consistent cooperation and goodwill from all parties thereto, to see to it that Cambodia transform toward a liberal democracy with full respect of human rights within the confines of the check and balance of power and the rule of law. For supporters of Cambodia, beyond the enormous contribution from UNTAC in the past, all signatory states of the agreement should continue to maintain their commitment both today and in the future in encouraging national actors and stakeholders to abide by the commitment they made in the PPA so as to allow the Cambodian people to live in peace with both dignities and honor. I fervently hope that the 1999 Accord continue to be a relevant testament that continue to hold great promise for a good future of Cambodia well into the 21st century. And on that note, I'd like to thank very much Courtney, Dr. William Wise, and my good friend Brian Eilers for staying up so late, for helping us launching this event so nicely, so excellently. I also want to wish, I want to present our gratitude to the U.S. Embassy represented here by DCM Benjamin Wollauer. And I want to thank all the participants, particularly representative from the UN, from embassy, from also the researcher and expert who also joined us in person here. And really, thank you so much for making this event a memorable one. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all. I wish all of you a wonderful day, and I do very much look forward to continuing this conversation in coming weeks and months. So with that, I think we'll end the webinar, but thank you all for the conversation.